We are trying to streamline.
Yeah, but you're hearing here.
I'm going to ask Vicky.
Yeah.
She knows
Okay.
It's just the PC volume that was on.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, you know, I looked at you and I said, your eyes are familiar, but no, it's somehow the gray hair.
I know.
Your whole face.
How you doing?
Good, and you? Things are good?
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know me, I haven't been around quite as much. I'm Nancy Bush. I'm kind of the dean of the Braun. Other than as far as I know, they haven't taken my title for the psychology department, and that's probably the one that brings me the most joy, and I'm proud of that. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you again to what I guess we're calling the 7th Anastasi lecture, because the first one was the Knock 'em Dead lecture that David gave to us as his inaugural lecture in the Anastasi chair. And I have to warn all speakers that David set an extremely high bar by his initial talk. So we judge everybody by that, just so you know. But I would say to the rest of the audience, I think we're in for a great evening from the brief conversation that I've had with tonight's speaker. But my role, as one of the few people in the room, and unfortunately the numbers aren't mingling, is to remind us of who this lecture was named for. It was a pleasure for me to have Anastasi, however briefly in my career. I think she was a tremendous influence early in my career, reading articles and talking about her kind of classic paper, Nature, Nurture, the Question How. that I don't think anybody could have gotten through Penn State without dissecting. I know that that's something that a number of us have talked about over the years. But Anne, as a person, was also a great role model, I think, for a lot of psychologists in general, in terms of trying to be integrated in her approach to psychology. And I think that's part of why her paper and other papers were so good. As a human developmentalist, I would say that her work on individual differences and differential psychology certainly shaped a lot of my thinking about it. When I stepped down as chair of the psychology department and became associate dean, the office they gave me in the psych department was Anne's old office, and it hadn't been cleared out yet for final. So I had the pleasure of going through her notes and her books, and it had a profound effect on my thinking, just in terms of kind of broadening the horizon. People used to joke about her work, being dry and empirical. Well, it was also very theoretical at the same time. I think in David, we at Fordham are very lucky that we have an individual worthy of holding the Anastasi chair, who understands both the kind of pure research and the application and the implications of what we do in our work. And I would say that that's part of why I think his original talk was so good, was that he talked to, what parents and students should think about as they take the SAT. And yes, that's applications, but it's not usually the way we think of applications of how do you gain the test, or how should we gain the test. And so I think in selecting the individuals to do these talks, David, whether he thinks so or not, has come up with reflections of himself, and most importantly for all of us, reflections of Anne. And I think that's the highest tribute that I can pay to David, and I would say to tonight's speaker. So with that, I'm going to turn it over.
Thank you very much. So I'm very happy to welcome all of you and this annual Anastasi lecture. I want to start, as always, by thanking everyone who helped organize this. Everyone in the GSAS office, in the psychology department office, and all the graduate students who volunteered to help with many, many things. And primarily, I want to thank Henry Braun for agreeing to come and talk to us. And let me tell you a few words about Henry. Henry has a bachelor's degree in mathematics from McGill, and then advanced degrees in mathematical statistics from Stanford. He has spent most of his career, except for a short period at Princeton, at the Educational Testing Service, where he moved up the ranks, and he ended up being vice president for research for almost 10 years. And then, as a reward, he was given a presidential, distinguished presidential appointment at ETS for 6 or 7 years, where he had lots of time to do his own work and his own research. And in the last 7 years, he's been a professor of education and public policy at Boston College. His interests are both in statistics, and he has papers on statistics and probability and pure statistical journals, as well as educational measurement, and on the interface. And he's practically listed as interest school and teacher accountability, role of testing in education policy, analysis of large-scale surveys, and standard setting. And he was recognized by various societies in both domains. He's a fellow of both the American Statistical Association and a fellow of AERA, the American Education Research Association. And he has also a lot of activities in a variety of boards and other committees guiding standard testing and education and accountability. And today he's going to talk to us about opportunity in America. So please help me welcome.
Monday, but yeah, that'd be good.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming on this somewhat dark day. I guess if it were a lovely day outside, many of you would have decided to spend the time walking the Central Park. So, glad that you're here. And thank you to David for inviting me to the Anastasi lecture this year. As David pointed out, my background is in mathematics and statistics, not psychology. I did meet Professor Anastasi once, and looking up her history, I really began to appreciate just what a remarkable scientist she was. And a scientist, though, with a sort of an interest, if you will, in social justice, in particular, thinking about how one should be using testing to improve the human condition. And in particular, and I think this resonates to some extent with what I'll be talking about this afternoon, the idea that a test score is a simple snapshot of an individual. To understand how to appropriately use a test score, to interpret it, we need to understand the larger context in which that individual lives, and even the longitudinal trajectory of that individual. And that's something that I think applies more generally, and it's, I think, a dictum that is too often forgotten. So what I'm going to talk about today is opportunity in America. It's a topic that's a little bit outside of my usual, but I find very fascinating, because I think opportunity in America is something that has been part of, if you will, the American dream, the myth of America as a land of opportunity. And to some extent, that dream has almost turned into a nightmare. And I want to talk a little bit about how we can think deeply, more deeply than we usually do, about the issues around opportunity. So we live in turbulent times. I don't think it's going to come as any surprise to anyone in this audience, psychologically, socially, and politically. And change is washing over us year after year. And what we're finding, and I think what's disconcerting and discomforting, is that stability and predictability, which we tend to like, is increasingly rare. And unfortunately, many adults in our economy are not prepared to navigate these new seas and are finding themselves adrift or drowning. And more, the children that are born, birth cohort after birth cohort, find that the long shadow of the circumstances of their birth casts their almost in a deterministic way what will happen to them as they grow older. Let me just show you two pictures. The first picture is a picture of wage and salary earnings over the period 1960 to about 2000. And it shows the percentile increase over time by percentiles. We're not following individuals, we're following percentiles in the income distribution. And you can see that remarkably from 1960 to 1970, maybe a little bit past that, maybe almost as far as 1975, all the different percentiles were increasing at about the same rate. But after 1975, there was dramatic divergence. And so the folks who are in the higher percentile continuing to gain relative to the median more or less stayed the same or actually declined to some extent, and the lower percentiles actually began to lose ground. And this is part of this inequality of income that you read so much about in today's press. The second picture has to do with stock market wealth. And what you can see here, I hope, is that if we look at the wealth, 1%, the top 20%, it's almost about 95% of the total wealth in this country. And so the rest of us, the other 80%, own an increasingly small proportion of the stock market wealth. And when you add other wealth, actually, the divergence becomes even more dramatic. So as a nation, we're growing further and further apart in income and wealth. What is, I think, disturbing is that there's good evidence that this process is self-reinforcing. So this is something that is not going to stop unless something changes. And the accelerated accumulation of advantage or of disadvantage leads to profound differences in opportunity between those who are born at or near the top of this income or wealth ladder and those who are born near the bottom. And in turn, these differences in advantage or disadvantage lead to distinct differences in the opportunities for the children and diverging destinies. Now, one could address inequalities of income and wealth, and it's important, I think, that we do so we bring to the fore partisan issues, as the debates around Piketty's French economist recent book, Capital in the 21st Century. But by focusing on opportunity, which in some ways undergirds the development of income and wealth, maybe somewhat more bipartisan and maybe even hopefully post-partisan. And therefore, maybe it's a better place to start the conversation. And it also resonates, I think, better with the stories that America has told about itself from its founding until today. What is increasingly clear is that in today's America, too many children are born in circumstances which require them to be unusually heroic or very lucky in order to succeed. And so, not surprisingly, many don't succeed. And the result is a burden to them and to society. But it's not only those who are at the bottom of the ladder. Many children growing up in families, working class, lower middle class families, who do succeed to an extent. They get through high school, they get a high school diploma, but they find that they're still poorly equipped to succeed in today's economy. The difference between the signal that a credential like a high school diploma offers and the truth of what the individual holds that diploma can offer is often distressingly great. And particularly in an economy like ours, which is undergoing sort of continuing creative destruction, it's very up and become young adults, enter the world, today's labor market, very well equipped to succeed and have the opportunity not only to succeed at the beginning, but to upgrade their skills and so to succeed in the years to come. Some of you may remember, I think it was just this past December, a 5-part story in the New York Times, the page of the New York Times, about a girl named Anastasi who lived with her family, mother, father, and I think 7 siblings, in a apartment complex, a building run by the city of New York for homeless families. It was really heart-wrenching to read about the kinds of difficulties, kind of obstacles she faced and her family faced. And though the article ended on a somewhat hopeful note, it did bring to the fore the enormous differences that children growing up in these kinds of apartment settings and the children who grew up in middle class and upper middle class apartments only miles away, whether in Manhattan or other parts of Brooklyn and Queens. It also reminded us that there are over 20,000 homeless children in New York today and over 1 million homeless children in America. Now, Anastasi's story is only one story. There are, of course, millions of other stories. And stories have a very powerful impact. You can just think about stories like the Horatio Alger stories of the late 19th century, or Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Civil War, to recognize that stories can have a powerful impact on public opinion and even public action. What I want to talk about today, though, is not the story of an individual, but something different. And I'll call it a narrative in order to make a distinction. And in this narrative, I try to take a more systemic view to help us understand the dynamics undergirding these kinds of polarizing differences, and perhaps even as a spur to action. So what I want to do is a couple of things. I want to present a framework that I use to structure this narrative, describe a few strands and some promising interventions, and also some of the implications for the future. So let me begin by defining the terms. So we often read now about human capital as sort of the currency of the future. And human capital is kind of an omnibus term and can represent any or all of the skills, competencies, credentials, dispositions, social networks, family resources, and so on that can facilitate for an individual their success as an adult, parent, worker, and citizen. And I'm going to define opportunity as the paths by which an individual's natural endowments can develop over time into this human. That those paths for some individuals offer relatively few obstacles and give them the direct opportunity, if you will, chance to develop in a reasonable way. But for others, there are many obstacles to the development of the human capital that they need to succeed in today's world. So the framework structure that I want to propose has 3 aspects that I call gates, gaps, and gradients. And you'll notice on the top picture with the gauge, notice that on the left of the picture is a path that relatively easy to climb. But if you try to make your way through the middle of the picture, you would meet a series of gates. It would be much more difficult if you get to the top of that hill. So I use gates to represent, if you will, a reality that pathways to opportunity have gates. That is, they control access to those opportunities to accumulate human capital. Individuals born in higher strata, for them, the gates are mostly open. So they have multiple opportunities to develop this human capital. Whereas individuals born in lower strata, for them, many, if not most of the gates are closed. And that means for them, fewer opportunities to develop human capital at developmentally appropriate stages. And whether the gates are open or closed are largely determined by both private and public investments in these children. And by these investments, I mean not only economic investments. So this picture shows us private investments in children, with the top graph representing investments by, on the average, by parents who are in the top quintile of income. And the lower graph represents average annual expenditures by parents in the lowest quintile. And you can see that even back in the early 70s, there were differences, as one might expect. But those differences have been exacerbated over the last 30, 35 years, so that now the gap is much, much greater. So parents in that top quintile are investing 5 or 6 times as much as parents in the bottom quintile. But it's not all about money. Here's a picture that tells us about the weekly time spent in literacy activities by the age of the child and by household income quintile, where the 0 line represents the 5th or highest quintile. And you can see that enormous differences, again, in the lower 3 quintiles in comparison to the top quintile. So there's an enormous difference in the amount of time, usually the quality of time, that parents spend with their children. And that, of course, has an enormous impact on developmental trajectories. We're also learning daily, it seems, how important these early years are to proper brain development and to general thriving. And these are the kinds of conditions, if you will, the pathways to thriving, representing, for example, pre- and postnatal care, good maternal health, establishing good nurturing relationships, particularly with the mother, parental attention, and then things like adequate shelter, nutrition, low stress, non-toxic environments, appropriate medical and dental care, high quality data. These are the things that empirically we know contribute to the thriving. However, we find that there are conditions that lead to gates being closed, and that the conditions for thriving are not. Here are some of the risk factors. Being born to a single or cohabiting mother, the presence of a non-biological male in the household, multiple siblings, household income somewhere below 200% of the official poverty threshold. With respect to location, we now have poorer conditions in any setting, not just in inner city urban areas and rural Appalachia, for example, but even in many suburban communities. And also what I call non-economic hubs. There are centers of economic activity here. We think about Silicon Valley, Portland, Oregon, Austin, Texas, Washington, D.C. These are areas that are thriving in the new economy, and children there are doing better. But in many other areas that are struggling in the new economy, children are doing overall much worse. So the gates tell us about the obstacles to thriving, and gaps represent, in this framework, the differences among individuals in human capital at different stages. And again, what we're learning is that these gaps develop early, they persist, and they interact. And that the gaps that we observe now at full adulthood, whether we're thinking that's 21 or 25 or even 30, are the cumulative result of the dynamic interactions between the gates and the gaps over the child's life. And it's those dynamic interactions that make this so complicated to understand. So here are examples of some gaps. These are disparities in cognitive assessment at 9 months and 24 months, disaggregated by race and ethnicity. You can see, again, enormous differences, let's say at least substantial differences at 9 months, and much greater differences by the time the children reach 24 months. Differences on the order of anywhere from a half to a full standard deviation. These are really, really big differences, and they persist when we look at these children at age 5 as they enter kindergarten. So when children are entering kindergarten, it's far from a level playing. This is by now almost an iconic graph. It represents the results of some work by Boisi, University of Kansas, looking at vocabulary in children in different families, professional families, working class families, and welfare families. And what you can see is that by the time a child has reached 48 months, the children in professional families have experienced something like 45 million words. Working class families about 25 million, and welfare families about 15 million. Enormous differences in experience. Now, there was apparently just recently a report issued, brief synopsis in the New York Times, I think, that said that it's not just about the number of words, it's the quality of the interactions, if you will. And that's certainly going to be the case. But on the other hand, the quality of the interactions and the number of words are not uncorrelated. And one would expect that when you hear the same word hundreds of times in different settings, that the semantic network that you build up is much richer than if you hear this word only once or twice, or obviously not at all. And when we talk about the quality of the interactions, I think it's not just the linguistic interactions, it's also the nature of the interactions. And a dear, now department colleague, Herb Siegel, I think he has, did enormously important work on the quality of interactions. Again, and how they differ by socioeconomic class and by race and ethnicity. Here again are differences by socioeconomic status. On the left side, we see differences in vocabulary size, and on the right side, different words heard per hour. And again, the differences are rather striking. And if you look at the left side, you see that the child of a professional family, their vocabulary size is somewhat larger than the parent in a welfare family. Again, enormous differences. And these enormous differences persist and interact over time, as you can see, to produce very substantial differences in human capital by the time children reach young adulthood. Here's some graphs that in a recent chapter by Sean Reardon and a book called Wither Opportunity. And what you see here are differences, standardized differences in reading skills, both by black-white differences and by income differences. So the dashed lines that are moving downward are the differences between blacks and whites, which you can see have decreased from about 1.5 standard deviations to about 0.5 standard deviation over about 60 years. Whereas the increasing line is the difference in income between the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile. And what's particularly concerning is those little boxes that up at the right-hand corner that define the endpoint of that line are based on the early childhood longitudinal study, the kindergarten cohort and the birth cohort run by NCF. So these are really big studies. And so they really tell us something about where children are today. And again, now we see that the differences by income dwarf the differences by race and ethnicity. What they don't tell us are the interactions. What if we look at low-income African Americans versus high-income African Americans, low-income white, non-Hispanic whites versus high-income non-Hispanic whites. And here's the same story, but here in mathematics, and again, very, very similar. So we're saying again, well, black-white differences have decreased, though they're still rather substantial. It's the income differences that are really very, very striking and represent, again, a manifestation, I think, of differences in opportunity, differences in the pathway to develop human capital. Now, what makes this interesting from a theoretical point of view, but distressing, I think, from a political point of view, is that the gates that children face as they move through different transitions are not independently determined. In fact, they're highly correlated. So the gates that a child faces are going to be either open or closed in parallel, if you will, as a child makes his or her way through life. So children who are born to poor families in highly disadvantaged communities, not only as we've seen, will they have fewer opportunities for appropriate thriving, but then when they reach school age, they're typically going to be entering under-resourced schools, less challenging curricula with lower teacher quality. And then subsequently, we have this interaction between gates and gaps, so that children with weaker skills tend to fall behind, they're retained in grade, and then they're more likely to drop out. In fact, recent research suggests that children who are not at a reasonable level of reading by the time they end 3rd grade, typically the 3rd to 4th grade transition from learning to read to reading to learn, are 4 times more likely to drop out by the time they reach high school. Even if children persist through school, they're less likely to apply for scholarships and vouchers. They're not able, because of their differential performance, to qualify magnet schools or even exam schools. And then we have further complications because different components of human capital interact, so that many poor or minority high school students who have good academic records don't apply to top-tier colleges. They don't obtain all the financial aids that they're due, partly because of the lack of social capital. They don't have the support systems, the parents who've been to college who understand how to apply and how to sort of work the system, if you will. So we have the gaps, we have the gradient, the gates and the gaps. Now the gradients, the third component of the framework. And the gradients represent the relationships between various life outcomes and different components of human capital. What are these outcomes? Well, anything from employment, whether you actually have a job or not, the nature of that job, how much you're paid, whether you get benefits, whether you're able to continue education and training in that job, whether you're in a position to accumulate wealth, your health, civic engagement, and very important in terms of the next generation, what is the likelihood that you will form stable family units and have children in the context of those partnerships. So here's an example of one of these gradients. This is a picture that tells us something about how underemployment rates relate to credentials, in this case, education credentials. Now, underemployment is, the numerator of the underemployment is a combination of the people who are actually unemployed, officially unemployed, people who have part-time work but would like full-time work, and the people who are not now looking for work but would work if they saw opportunities to have jobs for which they were qualified. And you can see that for the high school dropouts with no GED, the underemployment rate is about 32%. That is almost a third of them are underemployed. Whereas if you look at the bachelor's degree and master's degree, it's less than 10%. So again, a very steep gradient in terms of the relationship between whether you are working at the level you would like to be working and the credential that you have. What I don't have here, that we have some data that suggests that even within a given credential level, the skills that you actually bring to the marketplace, that is your literacy, numeracy skills, are actually strongly related both to underemployment rates and even for those who are employed, the market wages. So the market recognizes both the signal in the credential and also the skills you actually bring to the job. Here are graphs that tell us something about the percent of births born to mothers that are unmarried as a function of race, ethnicity, and of the, well, actually, particularly here, again, credentials over time. And you can see that back in 1970, there were certainly differences by credential, but they were relatively small, 20% for the less than high school, and maybe about 2 or 3% for college graduates. By the time we get to 2012, the rate for high school, less than high school, is about 67%. That's 2/3 of all births born to mothers who are unmarried, whereas the rate for college graduates is now only about 9%. So again, a very steep gradient. And we know also that being born to an unmarried mother is a very substantial risk factor in terms of gates closed to thriving for the children. What's also the case is that the gradients that we see here in the United States are steeper than in almost every other OECD country. So that differences in human capital matter more here in the United States than they do in other OECD countries. That is, a steep gradient means if you're at the low end of the human capital continuum, you're going to have greater obstacles to achieving life results as opposed to those who are at the high end of the human capital continuum. Now we can ask, why is that the case? Well, in part, it's due to some technology-driven factors like the winner-take-all economy, skill-biased wages, where those of us who know how to work with computers can add value to technology and automation do well. Those who can't add value, who can be replaced by automation, obviously are not doing so well. But there are also issues around labor market demographics, weakening of unions of public and private, globalization, and the advantage of capital over labor, which of course was the principal theme of Buchanan's work. Now, all of these things apply across the OECD, not just the United States, and one can legitimately ask, why are they steeper here? That's a deeper question, one that I'm certainly not able to answer. But let's go for a minute beyond gradients, because the gaps in human capital and the steep gradients we see in this country interact throughout development to generate very different life outcomes for people. And then these outcomes, in turn, determine the circumstances at birth for the next generation. That is, whether the gates will be open or closed for their children. So this is what I think most of us mean by the intergenerational transmission of advantage or disadvantage. So I think a very plausible scenario is that this increasing inequality of opportunity leads to the accelerated accumulation of advantage at the higher strata and the accelerated accumulation of disadvantage at the lower strata, which is leading to this polarization in society. Now, studying intergenerational mobility is very difficult because to do it properly, you have to wait about 40 years, and most of us don't really have patience for that. But here's a little snapshot, at least, that gives us a sense of how we're doing. And by comparison, I have here the results for social mobility, intergenerational mobility for the United States, which you see here in blue, and for our neighbor to the north, the sleeping giant, Canada. The picture on the left tells us what happens to the children who were born to fathers who were in the top decile in the United States. So the tall bars that you see at the right say that children who were born to fathers in the top decile are very likely to be in the top decile when they turn 40, or at least in the top 3 deciles. In fact, the chances are better than 50%. That if you're born to a father in the top decile, you're going to end up in the top 3 deciles when you reach the age of 40. Now that's true to some extent. That is, if you will, the stickiness of being in the top decile in Canada as well, but nowhere nearly as large as it is in the United States. And similarly, if you look on the right-hand side, these are the results for children, for sons, born to fathers who were in the bottom decile when the children were born, when these sons were born. And again, there's a better than 50% chance that the son will be in the bottom 3 deciles if his father was in the bottom decile when the son was born. And again, while there's some gradient, some stickiness, if you will, for the Canadian data, it's again nowhere near as large as it is in the United States. So what we're seeing here is that while there is in fact some mixing within the middle decile, there's a great deal of stickiness at the extremes, the lowest decile and the highest decile. Now the differences in human capital emerge as a result of this interplay, if you will, among different forces over time. And it's difficult to isolate the specific targets of action. If we want to do something about it, what is it that we should be doing? And it's the complexity of these interactions, I think, that make it difficult to know what would really work or what might help. And so if we're going to design, implement, and refine these interventions, we really need to understand these dynamics better than we do. So let me just, in the time that remains, look at 3 particular strands: residential segregation, the psychology of poverty, and access to higher education. Now, demographers and sociologists differ a little bit on this point, but it seems like residential segregation by income may be declining slightly, or maybe about the same, but there's still very substantial differences in the kind of segregation by residents, by income, or by race and ethnicity. And school segregation is increasing, both by race and ethnicity and by income. And here's some statistics. 74% of blacks and 80% of Hispanics attended schools where more than half of the students were minority. And in fact, 38% of blacks and 43% of Hispanics attended schools where more than 90% of students were sort of a hyper-segregation. Typical white students attended schools where somewhere between a quarter and a third of the students were poor, but the typical black or Hispanic student attended schools where more than 60% of the students were poor. So we're getting really high levels of segregation within schools. What is the implications of that? Well, we can point to a number of deleterious effects. First of all, those highly segregated schools are correlated with differences in public and private investments in children. Both the private investments of parents can get the best resources, public investments in terms of the quality of the schools and the quality of the extra school environment. That results in contextual effects on child well-being, socialization, motivation, and so on. And these persist into adulthood and result in part in something that's referred to in the literature as a sort of debate. That is, more and more in this country, like marries like. High school graduates marry other high school graduates, college graduates marry other college graduates, and again, that's not something we're going to stop, but it does represent, again, an increasing polarization in society. The causes are various. Obviously, there are economic dislocations, zoning and housing policies, and, let it be said, racism. What are the remedies? Well, we can look at adult training. We can try some shifts in the labor market, work-related supports. Many people who are stuck in inner-city schools, inner-city locations can't find the transportation to go to where the work is, increasingly in suburban locations, or they can't get child care, so on and so on. And of course, housing policies. What about poverty and biological psychology? Again, we're learning more and more today about how long-term poverty, principally acting through stress, and extreme stress, which is sometimes called toxic stress, has strong impact both on adults and children. For adults, we see elevated rates of maternal depression, which again result in poor interactions with children, poor executive functioning skills around strategic thinking and self-regulation, which lead to poor decision-making, and of course, poor health, which has implications, much broader implications. For children, we see high rates of anxiety and behavioral problems, poor self-reported well-being, slower accumulation of human capital, and epigenetic effects that induce later susceptibility to stress. So we see really very deleterious effects of this stress, stress due to poverty, and particularly extreme poverty. Now, here we have some potential possible policies. For example, the earned income tax credit is doing a pretty good job of keeping some people, some families out of extreme poverty. Inflation index minimum wage would help there, but we're a long way from that. Extended unemployment insurance, which again is kind of a political football right now. Provisions for child health and child care, again, some political partisanship playing out here. Family-friendly work rules. We've seen it in the New York Times. Poor single mothers facing situations where every week their work schedule changes. So trying to deal with child care issues when you're working, maybe working 20 hours one week, 10 hours another week, 30 hours the third week, and so on, becomes very, very problematic. Better support for families, diverse family partnerships, and children's aid society. All of these are helping in that direction. Psychological services in child care and in schools. I do work with a project called City Connects at Boston College that tries to deal with out-of-school barriers to learning in Boston and in many other cities around the country. And one of the things that every principal dealing with disadvantaged population says, we need psychological counseling. These children have problems. Some of them have post-traumatic stress disorder. And if we can't deal with the psychological problem, so these are the kinds of issues that represent real barriers, gates, in my department, gates to opportunity. And of course, it would help to have stricter enforcement of existing housing regulations. As we learned from that series in the Times around Anastasi, here in a city-owned building, the city's own zoning conditions, housing regulations were flouted, and they were living in horrible, horrible conditions, and nothing was done despite repeated complaints. My third strand is transition to post-secondary education. What we're learning again from high-quality data is that many high school graduates, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, have major deficits in cognitive and non-cognitive skills. Again, this juncture, if you will, between the credential and the signal it's supposed to send, and what in fact is the reality in terms of the skills that high school graduates actually have. They also have limited access to counseling and post-secondary planning. They suffer from, obviously, significant financial constraints. Of those who attend college, many learn that the fact that, despite the fact that they have a high school diploma, they're not eligible to take credit-bearing courses. They have to take remedial courses, developmental courses, or all sorts of euphemisms. And for many of them, of course, it is discouraging and may obviously drop out even before they get to the stage of taking credit-bearing courses. And many lack the support and even the self-discipline to succeed. Now, there are strategies that work for improving the success in transition. The first one, of course, is to reduce high school dropout rates. Robert Balfas at the Johns Hopkins University has done a lot to identify, in terms of identifying what he calls dropout factors. High schools, a small number of high schools, relatively speaking, that account for the large majority of dropouts. And he's developed a number of interventions that seem to have an effect on reducing those dropouts. We also can increase support services to address out-of-school factors and strengthen the low-tech education, which works for many students who don't see the benefits of education in terms of the kinds of models that they see in their own communities. There are extra school services. Carolyn Hawksby at Stanford has shown that targeted mailings to high school students can increase rates of college application to college going. College Board across the street developing an online counseling service. And universities like the University of Michigan develop very strong support programs for rising freshmen to prepare them for the rigors of freshmen at an elite university, and that's again see great success. Within college, we have faculty and student mentors. We can have targeted interventions and support communities like the Boisi Foundation, all of which can make a difference in helping students get through those gates and transition successfully into college and to graduate. So what we have here is a situation of high complexity. Complexity is driven by a number of factors. First, we have multiple forces at different levels: supranational, national, state, local, all of which are either more or less susceptible to national and state policies. We also have the problem that averages, which we typically can see a more than negative deal because of interactions among poverty levels, race and ethnicity, immigration status, and location. So that this country is, and not just a very large country, but an extremely heterogeneous country. We have enormous lumpiness, if you will. We look at intergenerational mobility, very low in the south, stronger in the northeast, stronger in the north, and in the central north, weaker in the south. So again, any particular policy that we would like to develop is going to have to take account of enormous regional differences and even differences in local communities within regions. We also have to make resource allocation decisions. We have to agree on what are the outcomes and benefits we're interested in, and where do we get the best return on investment. Jim Heckman at the University of Chicago, Nobel laureate in economics, has been working for many years now on really making the case for greater investment in early childhood. And here's a little picture that he has that represents the return on investment for different age groups. And again, what this is saying is that our best bang for the buck is to invest early. The later we invest, the less we're getting, which is not an argument for not investing in one, but it is an argument for investing more at earlier stages. The Social Treatment Project at Brookings Institution, run by Isabel Saga, using extant data, shows that, in fact, human capital gaps that we see at adulthood could be substantially reduced by a series of interventions at key stages. Developing frameworks like the Gates gaps and gradients that I presented here, or some other framework, are important means of communicating to the broader public the dynamics that govern opportunity and the implications of not dealing with these polarizing factors for the future. And we need, therefore, to take a life trajectory perspective, as the impact of any single intervention will tend to fade over time. So unlike Cuba's art, which allows us, or helps us think about fragmenting the individual into these fairly correlated pieces, this kind of fragmentation doesn't do well for social policy. Just leave that to the Cuba's artists. If we're in fact going to go national, we need to take account of local needs and conditions, but without sacrificing fidelity to the essential elements of the intervention. So what we need is a set of interventions that are, again, to be somewhat alliterative, have to be strategic, systemic, systematic, that's through the life course, scalable, and sustained. But to accomplish this, it's going to require a level of commitment and coordination that is difficult to achieve with a broad political consensus on what effectively would be a new social contract. And unfortunately, such a contract is barely visible on the horizon. But doing nothing is really not an option. Inexorable forces, if not proposed, remain inexorable. So what do these diverging destinies that I've described present for society and for democracy? Here's Professor Joseph Stiglitz, another laureate in economics. And he said, well, an economic and political system that does not deliver for most citizens is one that is not sustainable in the long run. Eventually, faith in democracy and the market economy will erode, and the legitimacy of existing institutions and arrangements will be called into question. And more recently, Janet Yellen, the chairperson for the Federal Reserve, said in Boston, actually, I think it is appropriate to ask whether this trend that is referring to increasingly unequal distribution of wealth and income is compatible with values rooted in our nation's history, among them the high value elements of traditionally placed on equality of opportunity. So those are words to think about as we imagine what the post-partisan political world in the U.S. might look like. Thank you very much. I hope this is not too depressing. There'll be wine afterwards. Drown our sorrow.
Oh, I don't need a microphone. Henry, I find it amazing that you still believe there'll be a bipartisan group to question this. Here's my question. If we were talking about electrical power to turn on a machine, increasing electricity doesn't necessarily help. There's some threshold that ignites something and it goes. And relative to your talk, where I see it particularly is, for instance, in the cost of higher education. So yeah, the top quintile is spending $65,000 a year to go to NYU and Stanford. I'm not convinced that's where I should spend my money next year. So how do we allocate based on return on investment when there's more critical thresholds and gates, and all the research is going across the entire continuum and your entire trajectory, rather than saying we have to get to a certain level and then like maybe reevaluate and remodel that point?
Well, that's a good question, and it would take several hours and 100 people standing here to answer that. Yeah, the Heckman graph that I showed you, is just sort of one take on in terms of how society as a whole should think about, if you will, an investment strategy. After all, Heckman's an economist, so he was thinking about investments. But in fact, we don't have a single budget. We have many, many different budgets, and the higher education budget isn't going to go to early childhood education. And so I think it is still a reasonable strategy to say, given the fact that we do have these silos that are relatively separate, what is the best set of strategies that we can follow within each of these different transition points? But do so in a way that also recognizes the interactions across transition points. So, we should know, for example, that we should understand that summer melt represents an enormous loss. Here we have students who are, many of whom are academically able, who would succeed in college, for whom there would be a high likelihood of success in college, and yet choose not, for whatever reason, choose not to enroll, and their life trajectory typically goes into a decline. What can we do? What kind of investment can we make? Leveraging the investment that's already been made there. So that's again part of the, if you will, the investment strategy we can think about. As far as I don't think you have to go to Stanford to I love Stanford. You don't have to go to Stanford to get a really good education. What is probably more important for society as a whole is more investment in public education, which has been disinvested over the last 10 or 15 years.
You dropped out the gender interaction and you
I'm sorry, say it again.
You didn't mention gender interaction and all of that. And there's huge evidence that that's not.
Right. I just couldn't list all the interactions, but
Gender. But I guess my first thought, I ended up in higher ed, which that's where you went. But my first thought was actually much earlier in the talk when, the amount of money parents spend on kids and the fact that the fourth quintile is actually more than the fifth quintile. Now that
was time, not money.
Time. Okay. Time is an important resource that costs a lot of money. But if that moves you into the next quintile, then that's a valid piece. But my point is a little bit different. It's saying when I have unlimited resources, which the top 1% essentially do, then it doesn't matter if I push more and more and more money at it. It's just making your models more money. Like there's if you dropped off, what if we just dropped off the first 1% and your next 9%, and then we model? Do they make the gates and the gradients more attainable than they look as presented?
To some extent, but people do look. That's a good point again. And people do look at the difference between the sort of the 50th percentile, the 90th to the 50th and the 50th to the 10th. The 50th to the 10th, there's a pretty big gap there. So that's why I'm not spending a lot of time thinking about the top 1%. They're going to do what they're going to do. And they're only 1%. Now they have probably an outsized influence on the political process and so on and so on. I'm steering away from that right now. But I'm really focusing on the great body politics, if you will. And there what we see is, and there really is this, if you will, this hollowing out of the middle class. And what we used to call the lower middle class and the working class are beginning to look more and more like the poor used to look. And the big issue there is the resilience, the resources to deal with a unexpected income shock or an unexpected expense. Fewer and fewer families are able to. In fact, I was just reading the other day something like more than 40% of families in America couldn't deal with, couldn't come up with $400 to deal with an emergency. That's a lack of resilience. And one of the big differences between the kids who are born to families at the high end versus the low end is that resilience. They can take advantage of unpaid internships. They can recover from bad missteps because there aren't resources to help them go to the next stage, even if they've made that mistake or something's happened to them. At the low end, one of those mistakes, and you're done. And I'm not even getting into the whole issue of the judicial system. Another cesspool there.
Thank you.
You have two figures to compare. That in the United States, the second generation of children are so dependent on the success of their parents compared to Canada. And you also mentioned other countries as well. So what factors make our country so distinct from our neighbor and also other countries?
I think part of it is due to the fact that we have a much weaker social safety net. For example, in Canada, is very similar to the United States. And I have to tell you, I'm a Canadian, so I'm an American too, but I'm also Canadian. So I can go back across the border, things get really bad here. But part of it is that Canada has a single-payer medical system. They have better child support, child income. Their school systems are they have lower gradients in terms of the quality of the schooling for disadvantaged children, or English language learners. So, and again, Canada, like the United States, has a federal system that is, in their case, education ministry, like we do in the United States. So it's very decentralized in a sense. So, but saying that, there's much less local control in Canada. So it's this provincial government has much more say about what goes on in school than many state governments here in the United States. In terms of Europe, well, of course, you see, if you look at the Scandinavian countries, the sort of ideal to some social democratic institutions, again, have a very strong safety net, and they have much shallower gradients. It's still there. It's not. You cannot completely overcome private investment, private endowment with public expenditures, but you can do much better than we can. And I think to me, that's the lesson of the international comparison. Not that we should become Scandinavia, Sweden or Finland. Finland is now has always been for the last 10 years the poster child in education. We shouldn't become Finland. We can't become Finland. But we can use Finland as a goal, as an ideal that says, this is the kind of equality of opportunity that we should strive for. How we do it should be an American way, not a Finnish way. But to think that we are the best we can be is to me, a mistaken notion and a problematic one, given what we're seeing in terms of the increasing polarization in our society.
Related to that, your data were interesting but sadly unsurprising, which leads to another gap, which is the gap between research and practice. And if we want to talk about a post-partisan or bipartisan era that we strive toward, not very successfully at present, how do we frame the argument to try and at least incrementally move in that direction?
Well, I think that's part of this project that I'm working on, is to try to find what I call narratives that appeal across, partisan policy lines, because I think most Americans do believe that this country should be a land of opportunity. I think most of us can say it's not surprising. I don't think people are surprised to see that there's inequality. I think what people are surprised is to see the degree of inequality. And I think that finding ways to communicate effectively to the broad public, something that we on the research side don't do very well, we think, obviously. We need to work harder at getting the message across, but doing so in a way that is not accusatory, but is saying, this is the American dream that we all talk about. And how do we bring the reality closer to that dream? Because that dream really is an essential part of what it means to have a country like the United States, and what brought millions and millions of immigrants over the years to this country. And we are sadly failing in our I think our responsibility to future generations by not taking on these differences, which, as I say, which the data seem to support, are in fact increasing the polarization and the divergence in society.
I probably have a little bit of a different background than most of the folks. I'm not an academic. But one thing that strikes me in your comments, and I appreciate your comment on, is I think there's a danger that we confuse being descriptive and normative. So we say, gosh, people who go to college earn more. And then we say, why don't we send lots of folks to colleges that aren't academically very good and they're frankly not going to get any kind of education. And the guy who came to pick up my car keys recently that spent 5 years learning film at a third-rate public institution might have been, my sense of probably misallocation of resources. I also am a graduate of a public high school in the South, which was very much desegregated. And I understand the point about saying it's better when we have racial mixing in schools, except that I worry that in fact we can have on a broad level we have racial mixing, but in fact at school, all the white honors kids from one place and all the black vocational kids from another place. So that what I'm getting at is I think sometimes if we look at it at a distance, the solutions appear to be easier than they are.
Well, I would say, I don't think the solutions are easy at all. And I'm certainly not one who says everybody's got to go to college. And I think I mentioned equality and the extent of, say, local tech partnerships. I agree that there are students, lots of people who really don't want to go to college. And maybe are not prepared. They might be prepared 5 years down the road. But that middle 5 years shouldn't just necessarily be spent flipping burgers at McDonald's or delivering car keys. So that presumably an honorable profession or an honorable way of getting a living. But it does come back to this notion that that national solutions don't work unless they're built to adapt to local needs. And when I say local needs, not only in terms of the local community, but the individual needs. And what, unfortunately, too often federal programs, and I'm being sound like a Republican, so God forgive me, are the sort of mandated one size fits all. And that just doesn't work in a country as different as the United States. At the same time, we need to have something that really means something. And you have just these local interventions. Some of them work, some of them don't, but it doesn't scale up. That's where I think we need to have this middle ground somehow. And I don't think we're very good at devising these adaptive systems. In fact, I'm glad you raised this because I'm going to now show you my favorite picture, which I didn't have time to fit into the talk. This is an example. This is a picture of the coral reef off the Great Barrier Reef. I love coral reefs for two reasons. One is they represent an example of unintended consequences. So what we're seeing with global warming, increased carbon dioxide in the air. What we also have is increased absorption of carbon dioxide in the ocean, which leads to increased acidification, which is not good for the coral reef. So our whole ecosystems are threatened by the fact that these oceans are saving us from some of the more deleterious effects of global warming. But the other reason I like coral reefs is that if you swim along a coral reef, you can recognize, yeah, this is a coral reef, and here it ends. So you always recognize it is a coral reef. And yet if you look at any particular location, it's colonized very differently. Like just this little snapshot, you have very different colonies of creatures sitting on that backbone. And that to me is the model that we need for large-scale invention. There's got to be a backbone, there's got to be something to it. And yet it has to be adapted, or designed to be adaptable to local needs. Getting that right, nature took millions of years to get to the coral reef. We only have maybe 10 or 20 years to figure out how to get to the social policy equivalent of coral reef.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk very much. I found a lot of what you said I knew, but you put it together in a way that it gives all of us, I think, some new insights. And I wanted to go from the coral reef now into the future a little bit, to ask you to say a few words about the relationship of public and private investment in the future in terms of building programs. I mean, we know that there are very rich people who start foundations who give a lot of money to education or to cities, but that's not really what I'm talking about. What would you talk about? How would you help us conceptualize the relationship of public monies and private monies in creating policy? I mean, what kind of policy, what should policy say about where the private enterprises should really put their money?
Well, you're using the word private in a somewhat different way. Yeah, but we have a lot of very wealthy people in this country, and many of them are setting up these foundations with the intention of doing good in one way or another, whether it's a medical focus or public policy focus.
No, but I really meant the run-of-the-mill private enterprise. In other words, businesses.
Oh, business.
What should policy have to say to the kind of, not to the rich people, but to the ordinary middle class, upper middle class, the private world of money? I mean, where should they be told to act like citizens, like
right. Well, I think there are a couple of directions. One is investing individual time. Like you talk about Big Brother, Big Sister, getting involved in organizations that nonprofits. So, for example, almost every nonprofit has a board, and typically on the board you have the middle class, upper middle class people who become invested in the work of that organization. My sons-in-law was president of something called Empower, which is an organization that does work around the world to try to create entrepreneurial centers. The Empower's industry, so obviously they're just entrepreneurship, but they do great work all around the world in poor areas, trying to stimulate entrepreneurship. Because their feeling is building business is a way of bringing everybody up to a reasonable level. But I think there's another issue, which maybe is not exactly what you were talking about, and I think that one of the things that we should be looking for in public investment is to find ways to enhance the quality and impact of private investment. So in other words, if we invest in single mothers and help them understand what they need to do in order to help their children succeed, we can stimulate what I'm calling private investment at relatively little cost. I think public investment by itself isn't going to do it. It has to leverage private investment, whether we're thinking about it in the middle class, upper middle class, bringing to their neighbors, in quotes, what they do for their children, directly or indirectly, but also the people involved. Many people who are at that low level of socioeconomic status, it's not that they don't care about their children, and of course they do. They have limited resources, but they also have, again, the psychological limited bandwidth, because they're trying to figure out where the next meal is coming from. So if you can kind of relieve some of that stress, they can make better decisions. If you can help them understand what they need to do, they can do it. And with a little bit of support, then you have stimulated the private investment that makes so much of a difference. And the world today is so different. I mean, I don't usually like to talk about, my life, but I grew up, in the lower decile. My parents were maybe in the bottom 5th decile. But I grew up in a safe neighborhood. I went to a decent school. I had enough to eat. I had a roof over my head. And my parents knew that the most important thing was for me to get a good education. That was the one thing that was very, very clear. And I was fortunate that I was able to, make my way through whatever gates I had and get to where I was. But in those days, education, my parents didn't really invest in my education. They assumed that was the school's job. That's not the case anymore, right? We send our kids to after-school activities, we get them tutors. As soon as anything goes wrong, we look for help. There's an enormous amount of extra school investment that middle-class and upper-middle-class families do. It's an arms race, and the poor are losing that arms race, and we have to help them understand that there is this race, like it or not, and we have to help them succeed as best they can. Again, I'm not saying that we're going to level the playing field, but it's become so tilted that I think it does endanger what we think of as a democratic polity.
Three more questions.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Two points you raised about averages being too wide, and minutes ago you mentioned about being locally specific. There's some very good things that show up on the PBS News Hour, and they really come from the schools in most cases, and they really don't involve much money. There's a case in Washington where the football team was coached by a woman teacher. She got other teachers working with them, and they couldn't play unless they spent study time. And it worked really well. In fact, she actually forfeited their game because they hadn't all done their thing. That worked. There was one, I think it was in Oakland, where somebody got the idea of interesting things, that turned out to be mostly boys, and programming computer games. And it took off. They had, I think, about 30 kids volunteered for it, spending a lot of extra time. It's things like that. There was one in Chicago where they, of course, had that big gang problem. They had, the guy was probably in his 40s and would have been in a lot of trouble when he was younger. And he was coaching them on how to talk their way out of problems on the street. That kind of stuff. It sounds like it's not so much money, it's just getting that going.
Well, again, this is an example of the local innovations that make sense in that particular locale, partly because of the individuals involved. And the question is, how do you scale that up? I mean, or how do you, let's say even at a state level, what the federal government, be still. Even at the state level, how do you take these very inspiring examples and how do you scale them up in a way that makes sense and that represents or is likely to result in good return on investment? I don't necessarily want to have a woman coaching a football team in every school. That's not going to work. But what's the essence of that? The essence was that there was a link. I'm speculating now. A link between academic achievement on the one hand and something that they wanted to do for fun, playing football. How do we scale that up in a way that makes sense? And how do we allow individual schools all across the state or even within the school district, how do we allow them to figure out where in that framework, what in that framework would make sense for them? And how do we help them achieve that with presumably minimal investment of extra resources? That to me is the lesson that we could take from these kinds of individual, what I'll call anecdotes. And how do we turn these anecdotes into a scalable intervention?
One more question, Costa.
Thank you for a thoughtful discussion. One of the common refrains in discussions of this sort, and it's included in your presentation, is to underscore the importance of education as a remedy for income inequality. But there's an interesting irony that some recent evidence is uncovering, which suggests that educational attainment is correlated with with greater tolerance for income inequality and with less supportive redistributive policies. So from an attitudinal perspective, it seems that it's at least possible that the more educated our society is becoming, the more tolerant of income inequality will also become. And the less likely it is that people will be elected or policies will be adopted to address that inequality through redistributive policies.
Wow, I hadn't heard that one. But, For once, I'm almost speechless. Very disturbing for an academic, anyway. I would say that, yeah, there is this tendency, and certainly we all know, even though there's this, if you will, let's call it the liberal bias in academia. So most of my colleagues tend to the liberal side. In fact, at Boston College, I mean, if you're not liberal, you're just not there. Certainly in the School of Education. But I think in the broader world, I think there are these notions like, you know, hey, I got here on my own, and why can't everybody else do it? And I think there is part of the repartee that I have heard is that, well, you think you got there on your own. In fact, you benefited from a lot of societal investments. And there are other people who don't reap that benefit for one reason or another. Now, there is an issue, and I have cut out a couple of slides, but I didn't want to keep you here for 3 hours. But I mean, there is this issue of a kind of a tension within the United States, with American, you know, the philosophy about who we are, you know, between one sort of being fair and giving everyone an equal chance, and the other hand, is sort of rugged individualism. Everybody's got to make it on their own. I made it, why can't you? How we bridge that divide, I think, is part of this bipartisan, post-partisan dilemma. How do we get to a consensus? But at the same time, I think people need to, even if you believe that you've made it on your own, you need to then maybe think about your own and your children's life in a country that is so divided. I have a colleague at ATS who comes from Venezuela. His family is relatively well-to-do. They live in a gated community, and I mean real gates. To get into their compound, you have to go through 3 gates. And you know, your car goes into between gate 1 and gate 2, and then you look at, then you go to gate 2 and gate 3, and then gate 3 you get into the compound. And they don't walk around their neighborhood. I mean, it's a really very isolated kind of life. So yes, they have a good life relative to most Venezuelans. Now, of course, Venezuela has its own problems. But living outside, I think that's so uncommon in some of these countries. But in fact, there's a book called The Spirit Level. I don't know if people heard of that. That comes from 2 British epidemiologists, and they basically show quite convincing data that we are all better off the more equal we are. That is, in unequal societies, even those who are better off are not as good off as the better off in more equal societies. So yes, you can be in the upper middle class in Venezuela, but you're not as well off as the upper middle class in the United States, where typically you can still walk around in your neighborhood and have to, and you know, not fear for your life or to be kidnapped or arrested by the government for that matter. So I think that there is for those who believe in rugged individualism, then there's a benefit to thinking about what does this country look like and how will it affect you and your children, and who's going to provide Social Security if all these people are working off the books because there are no more legitimate jobs. For those who are more on the social justice equality, I think it's an easier argument. But I do believe, and there is what I'll call post-partisan movement. It's still pretty nascent, but there are people who say, look, we've got to get past this red, white, red, blue, Republican, Democrat, Tea Party, progressive, if we're going to really make a difference. And there is some evidence that voters as a bloc, or at least large blocks of voters, are beginning to see that they need to send to Washington, to the state capitol, people who are prepared to compromise for the greater good rather than to stay the more extreme positions. Whether that is going to gain momentum, we'll have to wait and see. Good question. Thank you very much.
So we have more questions from Henry. There's a reception, there's food, and there's wine, and so you can ask me more questions. I just want to mention one more thing. For those of you who can make it, tomorrow at 11:30 at Rosefield, Henry is going to talk about his value-added model, for those of you who are interested in education. And so in closing, that's